Hello, this is Dr. Jason Munsell. It is 10:54 Sunday morning, January 31st. Tomorrow is February. Tomorrow is the Iowa caucus. Caucus, cool. We'll see what happens. It could be really, really interesting. This is going to be a very brief lecture on chapter 12, just sort of taking you through the chapter. It's a little bit early in the morning, so we've got the sun shining in, so I put my sunglasses on, sunglasses that my sister-in-law found on the beach at Folly. It says they're Gucci. I don't know if they're really Gucci, but I like them. I think they're cool. And you know why I'm wearing sunglasses? Because the future is bright. And with my little PowerPoint thing, notice I used a windmill thing, wind power. You know why? It's a renewable energy source. So in any case, let me take you through some of chapter 12. We were already introduced to a lot of this stuff actually in a previous chapter. I think it was chapter 1, I can't remember. But in any case, it's this is this. And by the way, if you hear music, I just got sort of the 70s, my 70s playlist in the background, just because. Speaking of futures bright, I won, how much did I win? Right here, absolutely nothing. But this one, $3. So basically, what this chapter does is sort of works off of some of the stuff that we've covered in chapter 11, excuse me. But it starts again with this larger idea that I've been pounding home, the crisis being a time of danger and a time of opportunity. And so again, they're just sort of taking the reader through their larger new theory of the discourse of renewal, or inspiring renewal. And what the chapter starts off with is again telling us as readers and telling the scholars out there and everybody that the threat bias is stupid. It's very, very problematic. And so we need to not just focus on the threat, the danger part, but also the opportunity part. We can't just, it's more than just sort of fixing the immediate problem, that's part of it, but also there's more than just saving the reputation of a particular company. It's about renewing the company, looking toward the future. And it does offer Johnson & Johnson as a really good case study example. The company, whenever, they just don't want to emphasize threat over opportunities. And so again, it talks about the Tylenol Corporation. The Tylenol tampering in 1982 is a landmark case of largely effective crisis communication. The company was widely acclaimed in its crisis response for communicating immediately about the crisis, recalling the Tylenol product immediately to protect stakeholders, and for learning from the crisis by developing a new tamper-proof package for their product. So Johnson & Johnson actually grew their brand, grew their market following the crisis. So that they're offering sort of that as an example. There's some other examples, but basically, again, big point here is that we want to, if faced with a crisis, try to find an opportunity to renew the entire organization from that crisis. But also, it's about planning and on all that type of stuff. And I think also the chapter is a little bit wonky because it talks about the theoretical components of the discourses of renewal, but then inserts in there some of those golden opportunities. By the way, I'm still drinking my coffee. USC Department of English is where my wife works. I feel renewed. So the opportunities are not necessarily completely and utterly aligned with the theoretical points. It doesn't seem to me. So in any case, that's sort of wonky, but just know that that's there. So what I do in this PowerPoint as I go through all the theoretical stuff, and then I move to the opportunities stuff, and then I finally move to the last part, which is about the planning. So, theoretical element number one of this new, discourse of renewal, or yes, that's what it's called. Theoretical elements related to the discourse of renewal. The very first one is organizational learning. That's the first theoretical thing, and basically what they say is that organizations must learn from their failures. An organization should communicate learning in its post-crisis response as soon as possible. Communication about learning provides organizational stakeholders with confidence that the organization has resolved the crisis. It needs to, part of that, you got to showcase that you have learned. So you look at why you failed, fix the problem, but then communicate that we have learned, we have done something new, and blah, blah, blah. And also the book talks about these three different types of learning. Behavioral learning, which apparently is the lowest form of learning, because changes are not internalized by members of the organization, but are maintained by external control through rules, regulations, or technological systems. There's paradigmatic learning that involves both changes due to an external agency and changes enacted by the organization. But then there is what they really like, systemic learning. It involves an organization's learning in advance of a crisis and preventing it. Organizations seeking renewal are more likely to employ pragmatic or systemic learning rather than having a regulatory agency enforcing behavior on them. So that's sort of important. And so what you want is to learn from it and have those paradigmatic or systemic learning responses. And then, sometimes organizations don't learn from their failures. And so there are barriers to learning. Eliot tells us. Eliot. E.T. phone home. Eliot said there are several barriers to organizational learning. They explain that the key barrier et al. So there's more than that, more than just Eliot. Rigidity of core beliefs, values, and assumptions, ineffective communication and information difficulties, failure to recognize similar or identical situations that happen elsewhere, maladaptation, threat minimization, and environmental shifts, cognitive narrowing and event fixation, centrality, blah, blah, blah. So basically, that stuff is bad. So there are barriers to learning, but everything they're trying to do in this particular chapter is suggesting that you need to get rid of those barriers in order to learn from the situation. And so basically, and there's, they don't offer this as an opportunity, but I think there's a really good prescription on the bottom of page 229. And basically they said effective crisis communication messages should include discussions of organizational learning. I sort of already said that. But organizations need to say, hey, this is what we learned about the situation. And so having that as part of the post-crisis discourse is very, very important. So organizational learning is the first big component, theoretical element of the discourse of renewal. Got to learn from the failure, have that paradigmatic or systemic learning, get rid of the barriers that hinder learning, and then communicate post-crisis with all stakeholders that this is the new you, this is what you learned. Okay, second theoretical element number 2, ethical communication. So basically everything that was in chapter 11, and the values and everything like that. I do like on page 230, they say in the middle of that paragraph, organizations that institute strong positive value positions with key organizational stakeholders such as openness, honesty, responsibility, accountability, and trustworthiness before a crisis happens are best able to create renewal following the crisis. So that's very, very important. It does sort of talk about the opportunity one, but I'll get to that later. So basically, I mean, the aspects of this and what they say is you got to, before a crisis, create very strong relationships with all the various stakeholders, whether they be citizens in Flint, whether they be, if you're incorporated organization. Well, what are all the various things that you need to do? Um, and so it talks about Malden Mills provided an example of a leader who had developed strong positive relationship with his stakeholders prior to the fire of his textile manufacturing plant, which allowed them to respond pretty effectively. But basically, the long idea, or the big long short of it, is you got to create strong relationships before a crisis. And if your organization is not doing that already, with all the various stakeholders, whoever, I mean, did, yeah. So you got to do it beforehand. Provisional rather than strategic communication is the next little section. And basically, what they basically say here is that you got to look at the opportunities, and provisionally, I sort of, I don't like the way they talk about this, but basically they say renewal is often based on leaders' established ethical character. These leaders often respond in provisional or instinctive ways deriving from long-established patterns of doing business. Typical of discourse of renewal is an immediate instinctive response based on the positive values and virtues of a leader rather than a strategic response that emphasizes escaping issues of responsibility or blame. So basically, when they say strategic communication, what they really mean is communication that's not terribly strategic, or just canned messages that's just focusing completely on the threat and the image, and not some sort of patterned out system of values in your organization. So again, that's what they would say. Provisional really means that it's not provisional per se, but it's more you are enacting core values that have become a pattern in your organization, or a pattern of doing business, as they said. Then they talk about significant choice is part of the theoretical element of ethical communication. And basically, again, the big idea here is we advocate always communicating the essential information about what is best for the stakeholders while never manipulating information. So that's, get the information out to help your stakeholders make the choices they need to make. And that stuff is really, really important. Nelson argues for clear and unbiased communication in order for citizens to make rational choices and decisions regarding crisis communication. Providing unclear or biased information, stakeholders can distort their decision-making process, and as a result deny them the opportunity to make rational decisions. So you need to get information out there quickly. Free and access of information to communication is essential to effective crisis communication. In addition, this communication should be forward-looking to provide a vision for the future. So get the information out. Those organizations that stonewall, that don't get all the information out as soon as they possibly can to all the various stakeholders, while instinctually, that sort of goes back to provisional, basically, sometimes you want to think, no, we can't get all that information out. People will panic, blah, 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 blah. We need to hide stuff. We need to be more paternalistic or something like, blah. Get the information out. Get it out. It's on your road to brightness. So that is the second element. Ethical communication, have good values, strong positive stakeholder relationships before a crisis, good values before a crisis. Since if you have those patterns of value, ideally you will enact those through the crisis. Get the information out quickly as possible. And again, I'm going to come back to the various opportunities. Theoretical element number 3. Prospective versus retrospective vision. So again, we're not focusing just on the past. What happened? Let's save our butts and just focus on the image. But looking at the future, how can we renew our organization? So basically they talk about being, you can't candy coat stuff like this, but the idea is you got to be optimistic. So focus on the future, not the past. By the way, I put on the study, or the little PowerPoint, our comm study programs, philosophy of leadership. If you don't know anything about that, you can go to our website and read our philosophy of leadership. I didn't put the link here. Maybe I'll put it on KC. But in any case, the idea here is that when we think about leaders from our perspective,